Okay, good evening and welcome to this latest installment of Building the Scottish State with myself, Dr. Mark McNaught. And I have again the great pleasure to have Professor Alf Baird with us this evening. And we wanted to focus in this discussion on the links between language and culture, imperialism, and Scotland emerging from this union of this so-called union and being able to flourish as a culture and a language once again. So first of all, Al, thanks so much for being with us as always.
Thank you, Mark. Good to see you again.
Absolutely. So let's just begin, by just talk us through a little bit. We were talking before the show started about the post-colonial literature that you've been focusing on and the theories that you've developed. So first of all, could you talk a little bit about the role that language and culture plays in in decolonization?
Yeah, well, as you know, most of this relates to the research I did for my book, Dún Hodden. And I covered a whole range of issues that were very prominent in independence or really decolonization process globally, in many cases around the world.
Just out of curiosity, what are the countries that you focused on? Was it exclusively former British colonies, or did you focus on?
Well, there's plenty of British colonies, of course, from Kenya to Ireland, Malaysia, Singapore. Dozens and dozens.
Some 60, more than 60.
There's loads. But it's a lot of the post-colonial literature comes out of French colonies. Mm-hmm. Very good literature coming out of North Africa, for example, and also the Caribbean, Martinique and so on, where the writers like Césaire and Fanon came from, but ended up Fanon writing quite heavily about North Africa and Albert Memmi writing about Algeria. Mm-hmm. And these theories that these people developed really are relevant, very relevant today across all forms of colonial or imperial oppression, if you like. So the theories are very much linked, and I can mention a few of them, like cultural imperialism, cultural colonialism, which affects a people, which then you get into the cultural hegemony of Gramsci, which we know from the class area, but it moves into ethnicity as well, especially in colonialism, where you have an ethnic or cultural division of labor. And then you get into the theories of enculturation with Bourdieu, and then cultural superiority, cultural inferiority, inferiorization with Fanon. In Scotland, we know the Scottish cultural cringe, which is a feeling actually of self-hatred, which is linked, oddly enough, to internalized racism, which people might not know that, but the Scottish cultural cringe is well known, where people have Scots themselves have a dislike of Scottish culture, Scottish language, don't value it in many cases, mostly towards the middle class. Then we get into the realms of cultural assimilation and colonialism, where particularly in the middle class, the bourgeoisie look to take on the culture, the language, the values of the dominating power, which in Scotland's case is very much Anglophone.
Yeah,
in terms of the dominating force.
Yeah, walk us through a little bit in what sense Scotland is a colony. I know it's obvious for both of us, but I mean, there's a pretty widespread, especially among the middle class. Oh, we're all British. I feel, David Cameron even saying, I'm very proud of my Scottish origins, but we're British and all this, and we're one big family. And the idea that that Scotland is a colony for some people is kind of offensive. It's like, no, I think for myself, I'm Scottish, I'm British. There's no contradiction. I mean, what would you say to them to explain in what sense Scotland?
Colonialism is really primarily about economic and political exploitation. So Scotland's economy is largely, if you look at the internal colonialism model developed by Michael Hechter many years ago, he found that the Celtic periphery in the UK was basically developed industrially to serve the core nation, as it were, which is England. So you have a very narrow specialization of industry, subject to shocks. You also have historically lower GDP, higher unemployment, higher poverty, higher deprivation, higher out-migration. and significant outmigration in the case of Scotland, between 3 and 4 million people. Some of the highest outmigration in the whole of Western Europe, and which at certain times was 8 or more times more than what was outmigration from England. So something seriously wrong was happening to Scotland after the Union, and this went on up until quite recently. In fact, outmigration has been a feature of Scotland's economic reality. So you have within colonialism, you have the economic and political exploitation. So all our political decisions are made out with the country, essentially. That's colonialism. So Brexit, for example, was a decision made out with the country. The Scots vote didn't really matter in the outcome that we saw. So you have that, but essentially in colonialism, it's also managed and controlled culturally and linguistically. So this is where culture and language come into it. Your cultural hegemony, your meritocratic elite is largely reflecting a culture and language of the dominating power. So within imperialism or colonialism, you have the political and economic exploitation, but it's delivered through cultural control mechanisms. And then we get into the realm of what we call the colonial mindset.
Yeah, and explain a little bit more about the Scots language. I mean, I grew up in the United States. My dad was Scottish, and I knew that I knew about Gaelic or Gaelic, however you want to pronounce it. But I visited Scotland numerous times, and I could understand the words for the most part, even though I just thought it was a really funky, cool way of speaking English, basically, and I didn't understand that it really is a separate language. And
we've got the two main indigenous languages, Gaelic, which in the census in 2011, Gaelic was reckoned to be spoken by 50,000 people in Scotland, and the Scots language by about 1.6 million.
Wow.
Which means that the other 4 million are Anglophone. but essentially, language is very important in culture because we know that language and culture form our identity. So it's usually a strong colonial mechanism, cultural assimilation, to drive out national identity from a people. And that's largely why people are deprived of their language. So we know in Scotland, the indigenous language, the Scots language, is not taught. It's never been taught in schools to any great extent, certainly not given authority. So the indigenous language of the natives, if you like, in the colonial context, is not given status or stature. It's not valued. It's regarded by educationalists actually as invalid. And British educationalists, English educationalists, typically, historically, have regarded Scots language as invalid, and this was the common, actually, the public policy statements up until the 1960s, which gave the excuse not to teach it. But essentially, it's about linguistic imperialism, which is imposing. You've got to remember that the Scots, we have our own mother tongue, our own mother tongue that we're not taught. So we end up in a bilingual. Well, what the colonialist post-colonial theory tells us is colonial bilingualism, which Professor Tom Devine wrote about this to some extent, describing the Scots as having a dual persona. We have a dual persona, and it's a divide between two national identities, between British and Scottish, and it's particularly prominent, of course, the middle classes in the colonial situation. The middle classes, the bourgeoisie, according to Fan and so on, they embrace the dominant language, the dominant culture, because it's the only way to make a living, to get on in life. So they discard their own culture and language. But that creates then a divide between them and the masses, as it were. And this is where your inequalities arise. The inequalities in colonialism are not just a class divide, but also ethnic.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit about your own upbringing. You were saying you grew up in a very working class household, speaking Scots at home, and it's somehow you through knit and grit you got to be an academic, and have been obviously a very successful academic. What were the tensions that you faced, for example, at school, speaking Scots, and what was that experience like? Kind of the contradiction between needing to speak English in order to make it, so to speak, as it was the case with my dad, and the natural tendency to want to speak your own mother tongue.
Well, Scots bairns or children, if you like, they enter school when they're 5 or whatever, and that's really when they start to first understand that there's a different language they have to learn, because before then they've been in the house with their mother and father and other bairns and or playing in the street, and so they learn their own language and their own culture and the rest of it. And identity comes from that, as we know. So the first thing they experience in school is the language is driven out of them. And this was historically the case with Scots and still is today. Lots of, my grandchildren today, and I have 6, but they go to school and they didn't ken that they have their own braw Scots language. It's driven out of them. And they're not taught the words. As they would in, say, Norway or Denmark or Sweden, they would become bilingual. They would learn English and their indigenous mother tongue. Even in Singapore, you have indigenous languages, and they treat English as an administrative language. So Singapore, you would have the 3 ethnic groups there: the Malay, Tamil, and Mandarin. And whatever group your family comes from, you can learn the indigenous language that you speak in the home and in the street, but you can also learn administrative English. So the problem for Scots is we're not taught our own language. And that's a damaging thing for independence in a sense, because it's about language is the thing that gives you your identity. The most important thing, according to the literature, is language and culture forms your identity. It defines who we are. Without the Scots language, there would be no quest for independence. I can assure you. The Scots wouldn't exist without their own Scots language. Because language is what defines and also what unites a people, according to the literature. And linguistic imperialism, the imposition of a language and the driving out of indigenous language, which is linguicide, its aim is the death of a language. And
therefore the culture.
And therefore the culture, and therefore the drive for that national identity. So it's all about the cultural assimilation, the removing of a national identity. And that's why it's an oppressive feature. And even the Council of Europe has repeatedly, in its reports on European minority language, has repeatedly called on Scottish and British governments to teach the Scots language. And you mentioned Gaelic. Gaelic language, even although it's a small minority in Scotland speakers, it was given a Gaelic Language Act in 2005 by Holyrood. So there's absolutely no excuse not to do the same for the Scots language.
Why do you think that is? I'm
I
sure
can only assume it's political. It's the colonial mentality.
You would think that people who were able to aspire to become politicians in Holyrood would have had to, take on the Anglophone identity and mindset in order to get up there. After all, they are in part of the British government. So
the problem with Holyrood and even the S1.EP hierarchy is they've not identified yet the importance of culture and language to the independence question. The independence question is entirely or very much related to national identity. And that's how the vote splits. The vote splits. If you looked at the Edinburgh University post-referendum data last time, it split largely down about which identity people believed they had, more British or more Scottish. And that's linguistically determined. But we have to remember our cultural hegemony, the people who manage the country, is very much Anglophone. The people, the elitist Scotland report that was published a few years ago found that over half of people in highest level positions in Scotland come from private schools. Privileged backgrounds, elite universities. Of course, they're more Anglophone. I became more Anglophone as an academic. I wouldn't have been able to become an academic if I spoke Scots all the time. So you have to suppress your own language to get on. What this leads to, though, is social linguistic prejudice. And the stereotypes that come out against Scots speakers are quite vicious historically, whether it's BBC, comedy, the narrative in the mainstream media is always downplaying the status of Scots speakers, Scots language, which is ethnic discrimination at the end of the day. and should be forbidden, really, in any civilized society. But of course, in colonial situation, civilization is a bit of a theoretical, civilized behavior is a bit of a theoretical concept sometimes, because the whole nature of the beast, as it were, is about exploitation. So we see this with the offshore wind leases recently. We've seen it with oil and gas in Scotland. We see it with a feudal land system, with lack of regulation, with privatisation of all the utilities to become owned by offshore tax haven groups. Scotland is just massively exploited. It's a very rich country. We're a very rich country. I should know that, having worked many years in shipping and trade. We are potentially an extremely wealthy nation.
I'm sure at least as much as Norway is, and they have a.
Oh yeah, we had as much oil as Norway. So
more. I've seen statistically more. That one of the questions ties in very well with what you say regarding the treatment of colonialism in any independence referendum, and how would you frame it? Because I've had discussions with other people, and they say no, this can't be a blood and soil nationalism type referendum. We have to be inclusive. We have to accept everybody. How does what you're saying about the colonialism and linguistic discrimination fit into getting more votes for independence? I know that's kind of a cheap way of putting it, but how should this issue be framed in any campaign for?
I think the New Caledonia referendum, the recent one, was informative in the sense that they did introduce with UN consent secondary criteria, which permitted only those who had been resident in the territory for X number of years could vote. So somebody just passing through in the last 2, 3, 4 years, maybe as a student or a worker or somebody just retiring there, would probably not get a vote. And this seemed reasonable, and it was certainly that was the case there. Of course, my view is that a referendum is not the optimal way to independence. And it's not even, as a matter of law, apparently a requirement for independence. No,
it's not. I mean, we in our SRG communications with EFTA, it's not.
That's right. And also the fact remains that Scotland has is in a treaty-based alliance, and ordinarily, according to international law, it's up to any signatory party to a treaty to withdraw from a treaty. So, and the violations of the Treaty of Union are many. So, I don't.
How many phone books do you need to?
I mean, how many violations do you need? Not teaching your indigenous language might be one. Because that's, remember also that the right to your own language is a human right. And so Scots are being deprived of their human right to their own language. So how oppressive can you be?
Before we move on, it fits in very well with what we were just talking about. Can Professor Baird explain to listeners how the current voting franchise is rigged in favor of the union and the implications that has for a referendum? And we were just talking about that. So if you could address that question before we.
I think the other thing about colonialism, if you like, is a sovereign people are no longer sovereign. They have no control over their borders. So in Scotland, there's no control over population. And Scotland's population has dramatically changed in the last 20 years, but also over the last 300 years. I mentioned earlier on about enormous out-migration of Scots, with many Scots given incentives to get out, subsidised fares and indentured labour abroad, and all the rest of it. And largely related to the fact the economy has always been underdeveloped. And that's another feature of colonialism, is the economy is always underdeveloped. And in fact, the people are underdeveloped. And we see that with high levels of deprivation, poverty, and
lack of education,
educational attainment. All these things are related. In fact, it's also health aspects. The former chief medical officer, Sir Harry Burns, once described Scotland, the label was the sick man of Europe, with very high levels of particular health problems and this was linked to deindustrialization.
Coronary heart, shocking levels of coronary heart disease. It was also very much to do with the diet. I mean,
but he linked
I think it's better now, but I mean, 30 years ago.
Yeah, he said that this was similar to the health situation of Aboriginal peoples in different parts of the world.
Wow.
Now, this is where he makes the connection to colonialism and ethnic discrimination, because the Scots suffering from this, and he described it as cultural dislocation. It's people are dislocated from their culture. Their culture is not valued. Their language is not valued. People feel, if they're made to feel subordinate, they will feel subordinate. They will feel less valued. And this really brings us then into the realms of other behavioural issues like the colonial mindset, the Scottish cultural cringe, and indeed internalised racism, where people believe their inequality, their lack of opportunity is deserved.
Yeah, or inherent, or inherent, yes.
Which is not the case at all. It's inflicted on them, and it's done so culturally through this cultural hegemony we have, and lack of respect for Indigenous language of Scots. So there's a lot of issues there. But I think the other issue on the franchise, of course, was that, nobody knows how this is going to pan out. But Scotland's in-migration over the last 20 years since devolution has been very, very focused on people coming in from south of the border. And that particular group of people having a British identity has the highest propensity to vote against Scottish independence. So the lack of any controls over borders, as well as other issues to do with that, then it means that the no vote is inflated. And we're also using a local government franchise, which relates to the Holyrood Parliament when it was set up.
Yes, I wanted you to get onto that as well. So
it was set up as a local government body that had power to create some acts over certain devolved powers. But essentially, it was given a local government franchise, not a national franchise. Now, a national election franchise in any country is limited to the national citizens of that country. And that's the case everywhere. So
that's certainly the case in France, where I live. Before Brexit, as a UK citizen, I could vote in local elections and European elections, but not in neither in presidential or referendums or legislative elections either. So I mean, it's normal that a country should be able to restrict the franchise to just citizens on things of constitutional importance.
Yeah, but fundamentally, Mark, if you taught your language, the Indigenous language, it would be likely in the long run that the vote for independence would increase, because that's what gives people their national identity. That's what unifies the nation, is the language. That's what gives people's diversity is languages. Whether it's Ukraine, Catalonia, Quebec, Scotland, and Ireland as well, Northern Ireland, it's all these issues are linguistic, and peoples in self-determination conflict are always linguistically divided.
Absolutely.
So language is absolutely central to this, but the Scots language is the central point. And the most amazing thing is that Scottish politicians have not identified this. I'm just a humble academic doing research.
If you were to set not the SNP, but the kind of the referendum policy for language, and as a vote getter, as something where you can appeal to people, even to people who feel more British. I mean, how would you? I take everything that you've said in terms of that people who speak Scots are identify as Scots, and we're much more likely to vote for independence than the more anglicized colleagues. But in terms of is that something for a campaign strategy for a referendum, or is that something that should be addressed more once independence is achieved and it's a question of developing policy?
Well, the post-colonial literature also tells you that the people know that their language is marginalized. Their language is subordinate to the dominant power that controls the economy and the politics and the narrative and the discourse and the institutions of the state. But the first thing they do on liberation, on independence, is to grasp their rusted tongue. They grasp, their vocabulary might be limited, but they grab it because it's the only thing that gives them diversity at the end of the day. It's a key ingredient in national identity. It is the basis of national identity, culture and language. And without that, there would be no motivation for Scottish independence whatsoever, I'm quite sure. And that's why also the basis of the independence movement is largely Scots-speaking community.
Yeah, and before we got on air, we were speaking about what Scots would be like if it hadn't been for the Treaty of Union and being part of that. And you were making the point that it was a Germanic language, and that it would be more like Danish or Swedish or other Germanic-based language, but definitely different from English, and it would have been because it would have been able to develop by itself without being polluted by English.
Well, I went to a seminar not so long ago on Finland's independence history back in, I think it was a celebration of its centenary from 1917. And central to the Finnish identity and the Finnish drive for self-determination independence was the Finnish language. Because remember, they had been forced to speak Russian prior to that. And this is quite similar to the Ukraine situation. The first thing people do is grab their language. It's the only thing that gives them that diversity and that strength of identity that is essential for self-determination. So this is what's very, very important in the Scottish dimension. And we can see this in the other Nordic countries, particularly. So the Nordic countries are all bilingual or more. And this hasn't done them any harm. I mean, I taught in Norway for 10 years, and practically everybody I spoke to spoke very good Norwegian, but they also spoke very good English. But they didn't lose their Norwegian language. They wouldn't cast aside their Norwegian language for a superior English language like we've done.
Yeah, and that's they learn English because it's so useful in communicating between different cultures. But otherwise, it's not like they think English is better. Or,
it's good for communication globally. But language is much more important than communication. Language is what gives you your identity, and without your language, you don't have an identity. Or you have to embrace somebody else's, and this is the problem with cultural assimilation in colonialism, is that the assimilated is never really fully assimilated. The Scot is always a Scot, just as the Kenyan is always a Kenyan, and the Irishman is always an Irish, and the Algerian an Algerian. Assimilation is in colonialism is a bit of a fiction. Although, as Professor Devine said, the first thing the aristocrats in Scotland did after the union of the crowns was largely get elocution lessons on how to speak good English. So, and this, of course, once the elite become, if you like, culturally colonized in that sense, taking on the culture and language of the dominant power, then that facilitates then what we've discussed earlier on, the political and economic exploitation of a people.
Yeah, and what do you think are traditional Scottish cultural values? Maybe somewhat separate from, and in my own view, I always felt Scots were, they just seem to care about each other more. They'd ask me like, "Oh, how's your tell your mom I'm asking after her." How are you? Or in what I felt was a more sincere way than you feel from many Americans. Or how you doing, buddy? It just felt like Scots seem to care for each other more than has been my experience. So
it's a much more focus on community. And if you go back to Mrs. Thatcher's famous statement to the National Assembly of the Church of Scotland that there's no such thing as society, everybody in Scotland just fell off their chairs because we actually think we have a social conscience, or we like to think so. But there's fundamentally maybe differences also I see differences in the business organization context with the privatisation methods pushed by London, which are very extreme compared to Nordic countries. And this is in ports and shipping in my area, this has been called and termed by people on the continent as the Anglo-Saxon culture model. of privatisation, which is quite extreme. And that was also including maybe not just selling off utilities, but also allowing the regulation to be handled by like offshore private equity groups, which inflates profits for offshore private equity groups. But we can see the penalty we pay in energy prices, for example, utilities in general. And there was a statement this week by, I think, a Labour politician in the House of Commons. The French electric company EDF, I think, had imposed price increases last week in the UK of 54%, but they were regulated in France to only 4% increase. You might be able to provide more information on that. I don't know whether that's true, but it seemed that national governments can provide this regulation on energy prices as we would expect. But in the UK, it's a bit of a free-for-all under the Anglo-Saxon model.
Okay, I've got a couple comments, somewhat critical, saying that you're living in you're way too theoretical and you don't understand linguistic, which I don't agree with. But how would you respond to those last couple slightly critical? What planet does Alf live on? He's obviously not been involved in linguistic politics in Scotland.
Linguistic politics. That's a good one. Well, all I can do is, being an academic, I can give people these theories of cultural and linguistic imperialism, enculturation. These are actual things that happen. The colonial mindset happens because of it. People disregard their own language and culture when they in that scenario. So, but you have a whole range of other outcomes here. We might say that the level of inequality and lack of attainment, as we discussed, is largely due to linguistic and socio-linguistic prejudice, which comes out of this. Remember as well that Scotland has the highest prison population in Western Europe. What the post-colonial literature tells you is that the native in this scenario works between two psychical and cultural realms. It's having to move from two. So you might see this in the context of a courtroom, for example, where a Scots person might be going in, or a classroom, or another institution, and they're suddenly dealt with by elites that speak quite a different tongue. And remember also that the language of English country houses that the BBC promulgate in Scotland has absolutely no roots in Scotland whatsoever. Has absolutely nothing in Scotland. That language, of the aristocracy, it has no roots whatsoever in Scotland. So culturally, it's simply an illusion. It's a cultural illusion, as the folk singer Dick Gaughan used to say. And of course, folk singers were very important, and artists were very important historically, because they only got jobs if the aristocrats and monarchy gave them jobs. Poets as well. So to some extent, Burns might be an exception. And they had to then adapt their tongue and cast out their indigenous language if they wanted jobs. And that's very true in things like the arts, like singing and so on.
Yeah. Another comment here: language is for communication. It is not for cultural identity. I support Scottish independence, but if you want to teach another language, I suggest Mandarin as being more important. And my own view: tell that to Catalans, tell that to the Basques, tell that to the Bretons, tell that to the Welsh, tell that to the Irish, tell that tell that to the Native American Indians, tell that to the people, different tribes in Mexico. I mean, it just goes on. And I mean, yes, language has the form of communication, but it defines a culture. I mean,
it's also a human right, and if we're going to respect human rights, we need to respect our languages. They're there for a reason. They develop for a reason. They're naturally developed by people over centuries, languages. So that's very important. We also protect diversity of wildlife, birds and other things, but we should also think about languages as the diversity of humans, as adding to the diversity of human people.
Absolutely. I forget the name of the book I read several years ago, but it was basically talking about the way that separate species develop in the same way that languages develop differently. They're kind of you have a flock of butterflies on a mountain, and then one flock goes one way and one flock goes the other way. And then over time they evolve differently, even though they were the same flock at one point.
Well, actually, the linguists that are into this, like the Wittgenstein and so on, talk about the way that language actually determines the way a people behave.
And both.
Yeah, it's their culture is about the way the things they do, the way they do things, but this is also done linguistically. But we should also remember when the chap was the commentator there was talking about Mandarin, Russian, English, whatever. These are also regarded in language terminology as bully languages in many cases, because the imperial languages are about pushing minority languages out the way. Yeah. And reducing diversity and reducing nationalities, if you like. It's a very liberalism, globalized ideal to have one or a couple of global languages. But as Professor Mearsheimer, even commentating on the Ukraine debate not so long ago, would say that when we're talking about liberalization and liberalism and nationalism, nationalism is also about ethnic groups protecting their own identities as well, rather than. But colonialism and imperialism is about driving these national identities out. And I mentioned linguicide as being one part of that. Cultural and linguistic imperialism is part of that. These are all well-established theories. We can either disregard them or if we want. But the other thing here is language is a key part of national identity, and there wouldn't be any quest for Scottish independence without the Scots language, in my view. The Scots language is the Scottish language speakers are the basis of the independence movement. And without a national identity, there would be no momentum for Scottish independence.
Okay. Our friend Finlay has added, but the Scots are mostly English thinking and put English first and foremost. If you work among most Scots, they are very English. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think you have to expect that, because that's part of cultural assimilation in colonialism. Of course, a lot of Scots people sound English. And that's a fact. But a lot of Scots didn't sound English. A lot of Scots didn't sound English. And the difficulty is that where they're not respected, where they're not taught their language, where they don't have the opportunities for intellectual advancement and social and economic progress, then they become marginalized. And that's what we see with the cultural dislocation of a people. That's why we have a large part of the population living in deprivation, inequality, poor health in many cases. That's why we have a lack, Scottish cultural cringe, remember, is about a lack of confidence of a people. A people lacking in confidence to manage their own affairs. So it's part of the colonial mindset to put the mindset within a people that are subjugated, that they can't manage their own affairs, that they're inferior, they're incapable of managing their own affairs. And this is related to their culture and their language partly, which is based on the stereotypes the state gives them.
Okay.
The Radzi Nisbet stuff and so on.
I get the belt for speaking broad Glaswegian. Scots language has many dialects, not just Gaelic, and I would take issue with that, because Gaelic is a Celtic language, like Breton, and whereas Scots is more of a Germanic. So they're not. I think they're kind of separate roots.
You're right. The Gaelic language is
Scots isn't, and Scots as a language is not a dialect. And anyway, how would you?
But I think it goes back to the origins of Scotland, back to around the 800s, when we had the merger of the Picts and the Dalriada Scots of Argyll. The Dalriada Scots of Argyll were, very closely connected to Ireland, and that's where the Celtic language would inevitably have come through. Whereas the Pictish Scots, using the symbols and vocabulary and alphabet that they had, probably was the forerunner of Old Scots, if you like. Yeah. And so we had this merger. And the Scots speakers are basically probably the descendants of the Pictish people, whereas the Gaelic speakers are the descendants more so of the Dalriada Scots of Argyll. And that's what we had with the merger that created the Scottish Kingdom after the 800s. So language has been forming for over 1,000 years. in this. As we see with Burns, we bring it out once a year. But you talked about culture as well, and then we have Burns' anthem, Auld Lang Syne, which is a global anthem. So the Scots have given the world that global anthem, Auld Lang Syne, and its values in that as well. But we deprive our bairns that language in school. They should be learning that language every day. Along with English. There's nothing, there's not a problem. Bilingual.
Well, I know, there's no contradiction. I mean, I spent a good bit of time in Catalonia, and the Catalan is taught at school, but everybody speaks Spanish as well. And
it's normal. And
they learn, and it's in Catalonia, it's a linguistic immersion in Catalan. Yeah. And from what I've talked to a friend of mine, and they learn Catalan in the schoolyard, in the school room, but then they speak Spanish in the schoolyard, and they're completely, good, and they're most everybody's completely capable in both. And learning, and contrary to what a lot of Americans think, knowing more than one language is a good thing. It doesn't mean you're some effete French, fag or whatever. It's it's good, because
it makes it easier to learn other languages as well.
Exactly, and it's a different way of thinking. It's for example, in English you say drop, and then in French you say laisser tomber, or let fall. It's just these little differences in the way things are conceived that you learn through learning a different language, which I think is so enriching. And I certainly agree that if Scots were taught both, just like the Dutch, they all speak perfect Dutch and perfect English, or most of them, So.
Yes, it would just make us like the Dutch or the Norwegian or the Danish or the Swedes or the Icelandics. It's not a big problem.
Yeah. And what would you do, if how would you reformulate the linguistic teaching in an independent Scotland? I mean, would you do like the Catalans, where they had immersions, basically linguistic immersion in school?
I think we still have the language surviving to some extent. The difficulty with language, of course, is once it completely goes, it perishes, then the identity of the people go with it. So you have to worry about that. But actually, the Gaelic Language Act development showed how a positive legislation like that can actually change things quite well. And the Gaelic Language Act provided Gaelic TV, Gaelic language teaching in some primary schools and some secondary schools to higher level, and also a Gaelic language degree in university. So these are features that you would envisage in Scots, much more widely, of course, because most peoples in Scotland, in most areas, there are Scots speakers still. So there's not a problem in doing that. One of the difficulties is that many of the teachers within the teaching profession are not Scots, so don't have the language. We have to remember that Scotland's meritocracy is largely being sourced, professional and managerial class has largely been sourced outside Scotland for a long, long time. So
you were saying that working in universities, that almost all of, the percentage of professors that are actually Scottish in Scottish universities is like really small.
It's probably it's less than 10%. It might even be below 5%. It's incredible, and
inconceivable here in France. Absolutely inconceivable.
Yeah, I mean, you teach in France. I taught in Norway for many years. 90% of the academics or more were Norwegian.
Of course,
and I was only a visiting professor. Yeah, but in Scotland, it's the norm. And remember, also at teaching level in some counties of Scotland, over half the teachers are not Scots. Therefore, the teachers in the schools don't have the Scots language.
Yeah.
It's not their tongue. So they've no interest in teaching it.
And no knowledge.
They've no knowledge, no awareness. They didn't ken it. They didn't ken the language. So they would have to, in some schools, there would have to be teaching courses for teachers to learn Scots a wee bit. It doesn't have to be. The other problem of learning books in Scots language were actually still around when I was at school in the 60s, at primary school. We actually had printed texts on Scots language that we were still learning in the 60s, but that was all taken away as the print and other companies and all these Scots language things were cancelled out. So Scots language, there was a renaissance around the 60s, I think, to teach Scots in schools, but it petered out, and that was that. But essentially, a Scots Language Act, which would be a right of all Scots, it should be passed by Holyrood. It should have been done many years ago. It could have been done in 2005, the same time as the Gaelic Language Act, but the decision makers decided not to do it. And that also brings us to maybe a Scots language channel that would be a good idea.
What about the Doric?
Well, Doric
explain what Doric is, and
Doric is a dialect of Scots for the northeast of Scotland. There's dialects of Scots all over Scotland. Orkney Scots, Shetland Scots, Highland Scots, West Scotland Scots, Lowland Scots, Edinburgh Scots. There's different Scots dialects, just as there's different dialects of English. But the basic Scots language remains pretty much the same, universal. And there's Scots dictionaries and Scots grammar texts that I have and use quite a lot that are freely available. Are available. Scots dictionaries available online as well. So it's not difficult. You know, a little bit of work, you can put whole sentences together in Scots. It's not that difficult. But it has to be done at the sponge time of life, which is the bairns, the kids at school. That's when it has to be done. If it's no done then, they end up being confused. And they get what Professor Tom Devine calls this dual persona, this dual identity. And then we're into the Scottish cultural cringe, when they know that they don't get anywhere in the social economic hierarchy without being Anglophone. They have to discard the Scots language. They have to subordinate it, denigrate it, kill it off to get on in life within their own land. And that's the tragedy. And that's why many Scots don't attain. They don't, and they're disadvantaged because of their language. And also things like answering exam questions in Scots. You mean, so a lot of people actually speak and think in Scots, not necessarily in English. So answering exam questions for many people might be quite difficult in English. But they're marginalised because of that. There's many Scots, as we talked about with education and professors in university and academics even, 90% of the academics at the elite universities in Scotland are not Scots. There's many opportunities there for Scots to take these roles rather than to appoint people from outside Scotland all the time.
And you mentioned before that a lot of times when they advertise the posts at Scottish universities, they advertise them in London or in England.
But that's always the case, Mark. Everything is advertised for academics in the Times Higher Education in London. And all high level posts in Scotland are advertised in the London press.
It just blows my mind.
That's why you get your meritocracy. And I compared it before, I think, to Denmark advertising all its best jobs in Berlin. and then of course insisting that all the best jobs are given to people that speak German in Denmark.
because German's better. You know, German's a better language. It's superior.
Well, yeah, Danish isn't a very good language. In fact, I don't think
for the riffraff at the football match.
They might want independence. And of course, we know that Denmark was, of course, occupied. And this brings us back to the colonial reality, because in a sense, colonialism is also, to a degree, occupation, culturally as well as in all other respects. And that's a distinguishing feature.
We've touched on a few examples, but can you give us some more concrete examples of that? How this degree of imperialism that exists in Scotland, that many I presume don't really see. They watch their TV shows, they appreciate the English culture, what are if you could explain to us the examples of how this colonialism is exerted in Scotland that may not be that apparent to many.
Yeah, well, there's variations on colonialism affecting us in the sense the relation to the theory of internal colonialism, which has also been described slightly differently as domestic colonialism by other writers in the past. But essentially, what you end up with is with a cultural hegemony that's not Scots. The cultural meritocratic elite tends not to be Scottish cultural, Scottish language, Scottish culture. Then you end up with a cultural hegemony that's pretty much Anglophone dominated, and we talked about most of the top positions being advertised in the London press. And because they're advertised in the London press, of course, they then become open to a population 10 times larger south of the border. Yeah. But essentially, there's no linguistic requirement for Scotland. For people coming here to take positions to speak Scots. And this is the difference between, say, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, or Germany even, or Holland. If you were to apply for a public sector position, for example, in these countries, you would have to speak the indigenous language, or you would have to have some knowledge of it to then apply for that position. Not that these countries would necessarily advertise all their best public sector jobs out with the country. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The key thing for a people, of course, is for a government in Scotland is to lift up its own people. You know, we have very high levels of poverty, deprivation, inequality, food banks. We have people can't afford their energy. The utilities have all been sold off. The economy is just. In colonialism, of course, the economy is always underdeveloped. Mm-hmm. And I know this in a port context. We are really underdeveloped in that sense internationally. And also, it leaves many of the people marginalized and underdeveloped as well. They don't get the opportunities, the intellectual opportunities that are expected in other countries, like, as we said, Norway and Denmark, or Finland, where the indigenous people have equal opportunity. With a colonial situation, the indigenous people are marginalized, and they're intentionally marginalized, and that will continue until liberation.
Okay. Well, our friend Laugh66Q has having one last stab at it. Okay. My question is, why do the panelists think language is so important? It is a niche concern and will have no impact on the wider Scottish world. And I have my own way of responding to that, but what would you answer?
Well, as an academic, all I can do is refer to the theory that language and culture is what gives you your identity, and that's been proven many times. Language determines our national attachment. You know, these are facts of well established facts in language theory and also colonialism. So language is absolutely central to independence and to national identity. Without the Scots language, we really are. There would be no momentum for independence at all.
And is that getting back to what I think he was asking before, is that a vote getter in a campaign? I mean, can you go around chapping on the doors and saying, okay, well, look, the Scottish language has been repressed, vote for independence because we'll be able to bring back the Scots language? I mean, is that something that is it something that should be seen in the context of a quote unquote vote getter, or is it more something that needs to be developed after independence?
I think fundamentally there's a bigger issue here, Mark, in that people don't really understand, even politicians don't really understand what independence is. But when you look at the literature on independence globally, even with the UN, independence is about decolonization. Mm-hmm. That's what independence is, and that's what
that links in perfectly with one of the questions we didn't get to. What part can the UN play in recognition of Scotland as a colony, and can we use this to help self-determination?
Well, the UN under the Charter provide that people have a right to self-determination. Scotland also has a right to independence and right to withdraw from its own treaty arrangements, as we know. So there's different things there. The difficulty with the UN is still dominated by certain very large powers that are colonial or imperial in nature. Yeah. And for a whole variety of reasons wouldn't welcome Scottish independence. So that's another issue. But essentially, the Charter on Self-Determination of Peoples. Remember, of course, the UN was established originally as a remedy to, if you like, in a sense, to cancel out the empires, the imperial powers that had existed.
To have a kind of a means by which decolonization can occur in a relatively orderly manner without too much people killing each other.
But basically, essentially, what I've found is that for Scotland Scotland fits, as far as I can see, Scotland fits all the features of a colony, whether it's economic, political exploitation, and cultural and linguistic factors, which we've been talking about tonight. Therefore, Scotland could be listed as a colony to be decolonized with the UN. All that requires is for a member state to propose Scotland's listing. And I'm surprised that Scotland's never done that. You know, we have governments, we have ministers that are supposed to be responsible for the constitution in Holyrood, but they've never went to the UN and listed Scotland for decolonization. They perhaps believe Scotland is not a colony. Scotland's relationship with the UK, with England and the rest of the UK, as it were, is treaty based, but sovereignty is not respected. It's not respected by the treaty alliance partners, the main treaty alliance partner, which is England, and it's not respected either by the majorities of Scotland's independence representatives, or the majority of Scotland's representatives elected who ostensibly support independence, but who refuse to assert sovereignty and refuse to withdraw Scotland from the treaty. So in that sense, the politicians, the political representatives have failed the people. But there's absolutely nothing to stop Scotland from being listed as a colony for decolonization. And that would, people have a right under the UN Charter to independence.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting near the end of our time, but anything you'd like to say in parting? Maybe I could ask you just what your view is the current state of going towards independence. We have all these different comments by that are taken up by the media, what Ian Blackford said about not being, and then about not standing down as a party leader in Westminster and reasserting that, yes, indeed, there will be a referendum soon. But it's all very vague right now. And I'm not terribly reassured.
I think we've talked about it before, but the post-colonial theory tells us what happens where you have a dominant national party in place. They tend to
equivocate.
They tend to enter a cooperation with the administrative power in this case, which is the UK government. Therefore, they take the people up blind alleys. Of course, they're feathering their own nests, building up their own pension pots, as politicians do. But ultimately, in the words of Frantz Fanon, the dominant National Party politicians fear the planes and the tanks of the oppressor. So they don't want to push them too much. They don't want to poke the bear, as it were. That's pretty much the reality. What that means then is you then, in the post-colonial literature, it tells you new national parties evolve, as we see in Scotland. So the people then have to understand that the dominant national party has let them down, and you need to cast it aside and move on to new national parties, which will be much more focused on independence. And I favour hopefully the Alba proposal, which is a plebiscite election, the first plebiscite election, and get independence done now, as Boris might say.
Get independence done and drive through a bunch of.
Well, I think that's the other thing about Brexit. Brexit actually happened. People voted for it in the UK in the majority, and there was no plan. There was no plan whatsoever for what happened there. And this is where I think people elaborate too much on independence, trying to define what's going to happen with pensions, currency, borders, defence, everything. Whereas the reality is that would all be negotiated through after independence. The key thing in the post-colonial theory is the liberation of the people. It's neither a matter of policies of right or left or centre. It's not. These things are not the key thing. The key thing is the liberation of the people. And that's the most important factor.
So how is the trigger pulled, basically?
Well, I think that's what I just mentioned is the only option really is the alternative national parties that are starting up, and hopefully the people will see that that's the only option they have, because the dominant national party has just went the way of the theory.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, on that note, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, thank you so much, Al, for being with us. I appreciate our skeptical questioners. We always like to, get do a little bit of intellectual exercise. So I thank you. I thank all of you for your questions, even the ones that were, a little bit challenging. But so thank you all, and hope to see you next week.